It began on a quiet morning when the sun crept over the horizon, casting a golden glow on sleepy village nestled in valley. This place was no stranger to peculiar happenings, odd lights in the woods, whispers carried on the wind that seemed to come from nowhere, and shadows that stretched unnaturally long after dusk. But none of those quirks prepared the villagers for what they were about to witness. The first person to see it was an elderly man who tended to the fields just outside the main road. He had risen before dawn, as always, to check on his crops. But instead of the usual rustle of leaves and the soft calls of waking birds, he heard something that didn't belong, a steady, deliberate clopping of hooves against the dirt road. Looking up, he froze. A horse, sleek and imposing, was walking toward the heart of the village. It wasn't the sight of a horse that unsettled him. Livestock wasn't uncommon around these parts. What chilled him to the bone was the way it moved, purposeful and unhurried, as though it knew exactly where it was going. Word spread like wildfire. Soon, people emerged from their homes, curious to see the animal that had wandered into their lives. It was tall and striking, its dark coat gleaming as though it had been polished. There was no saddle, no bridle, and no sign of an owner anywhere in sight. But it wasn't just its appearance that captivated them. There was something in the way it carried itself, majestic, almost regal, with an air of intelligence that felt deeply unnatural. Children, clutching their parents' hands, pointed at the horse with wide-eyed wonder. Some of the braver villagers edged closer, whispering among themselves. Could it be lost? Had it wandered off from a neighboring town? Yet, as they watched, unease began to seep in. The horse didn't hesitate or appear to be searching for anything familiar. It seemed as if it was looking for someone or something. An older woman, known for her tales of omens and old-world superstitions, gasped when she saw the animal and immediately crossed herself. "That's no ordinary horse," she muttered, her voice trembling. But when pressed for an explanation, she shook her head and retreated into her home, slamming the door behind her. The horse continued its steady pace, unbothered by the gathering crowd. Its eyes, a deep and unsettling shade of black, seemed to scan every face it passed, as if weighing their souls. Every step it took deepened the tension in the air, and the villagers couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a chance encounter. Someone or everyone was being judged. By the time the horse reached the village square, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Conversations were hushed, and even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. The horse paused, its ears twitching as though listening to something only it could hear. Then, it turned its head toward an old well that had been out of use for decades. Without hesitation, it began to move again, its hooves echoing like a metronome. And that's when the questions turned to fear. What was it looking for? And why did it seem so certain about where to go? The crowd stood frozen as the horse moved closer to the old well, its steady steps accompanied by an unsettling silence. It was as if the entire world held its breath, waiting for whatever would come next. The well had stood unused for as long as anyone could remember, its stone walls covered in moss and its wooden cover sagging under the weight of time. Children were often warned to stay away from it, not because it was dangerous, but because there was an unspoken rule among the villagers to leave it alone. Nobody could explain why. It was just something they did, like locking the doors at sunset or avoiding the woods after dark. The horse stopped at the edge of the well, lowering its head slightly as though examining it. The villagers whispered among themselves, each voice a mixture of curiosity and dread. Some said it must have been drawn to the scent of water, but others shook their heads, uneasy with how deliberate its actions seemed. Horses didn't behave like this. Animals didn't behave like this. A young boy, no more than 8, broke away from the crowd and took a tentative step forward. His mother hissed his name, grabbing at his arm, but he slipped from her grasp. "It's just a horse," he called back, his voice small but defiant. The horse didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge the boy as he approached. It remained still, its eyes fixed on the well. The boy reached out a hand, his fingers trembling slightly as he moved closer. The crowd collectively held their breath. Just as his fingertips brushed the horse's dark coat, it turned its head sharply, meeting his gaze. The boy froze, his hand hovering in the air. For a moment, it was as though the two were locked in some silent conversation. Then, as quickly as it had started, the horse turned its attention back to the well, and the boy stumbled backward, his face pale. "What did you see?" an older man asked, stepping forward to steady the boy. The child shook his head, his lips trembling as he searched for the words. "Its eyes," he whispered finally. It looked like it was talking to me. Like it knew me." The murmurs among the villagers grew louder. Some dismissed the boy's words as the ramblings of a scared child, but others weren't so sure. There was something undeniably strange about the horse, and the longer it stayed, the more the tension in the air grew. One of the braver villagers, a middle-aged woman who ran the local bakery, stepped forward next. "Enough of this," she said firmly, though there was an edge of fear in her voice. "It's just an animal. Someone needs to lead it away from here before we all scare ourselves silly." But as she approached, something stopped her in her tracks. It wasn't the horse, it was the well. She could have sworn she heard something. A faint noise, almost like a whisper, coming from deep within the darkness. She froze, her eyes fixed on the stone structure as her mind raced. Was it her imagination? The villagers watched as her expression shifted, confusion giving way to fear. Without a word, she backed away, retreating into the crowd. "What is it?" someone asked, but the woman shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together. She didn't answer, and the crowd grew restless. The horse remained by the well, its posture calm but unnervingly focused. The whispers from the crowd grew louder, each theory more outlandish than the last. Some claimed it was an omen, a sign of something terrible to come. Others insisted it must have belonged to someone, a traveler or a farmer who would soon arrive to reclaim it. But the question lingered, why the well? A man who had lived in the village his entire life stepped forward, his face etched with years of wisdom and worry. "I remember something," he said slowly, his voice trembling slightly. "A story my grandmother used to tell. About the well." The crowd fell silent, all eyes on him. She said it wasn't just a well. It was a marker. A place where something was buried a long time ago. Something that wasn't supposed to be found. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Some scoffed, dismissing it as an old wives' tale, but others exchanged uneasy glances. In a village like theirs, where history seeped into every stone and shadow, stories often held more truth than they cared to admit. "What was buried?" someone asked, their voice barely above a whisper. The old man shook his head. "She never said? Just that it was meant to stay hidden. And that we should leave it alone." The horse snorted softly, as if in response, and the sound sent a shiver through the crowd. The villagers looked at one another, unsure of what to do. The horse wasn't harming anyone, but its presence felt like a challenge, like it was daring them to act. As the day wore on, the atmosphere grew heavier. People returned to their homes, but nobody truly left. Windows and doors remained cracked open, eyes peering out at the well and the horse that refused to leave. The village square, usually lively with chatter and laughter, had become eerily quiet. Night fell, and still, the horse remained. The villagers whispered about it over dinner, their words growing more fearful as the darkness deepened. Some swore they heard footsteps outside their doors, though when they looked, the streets were empty. Others claimed they saw shadows moving where no one should be. By midnight, the tension had reached a breaking point. A small group of men gathered in the square, armed with lanterns and tools. "We need to do something," one of them said, his voice shaking slightly. "This isn't right. We can't just let it stay there." But as they approached the well, lanterns casting long, flickering shadows, the horse turned to face them. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but something in its gaze stopped them cold. They couldn't explain it, but an overwhelming sense of dread washed over them, rooting them to the spot. One by one, they backed away, retreating into the safety of their homes. The horse watched them go, its dark eyes gleaming in the faint light. It returned its attention to the well, standing as still as a statue, waiting for something that only it seemed to understand. And so the night passed, the village gripped by an uneasy silence. Nobody slept, and nobody dared to approach the square again. When dawn finally broke, the horse was still there, its shadow stretching long across the cobblestones. Whatever it was looking for, it hadn't found it yet. But the villagers couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time. As the days passed, the presence of the horse in the village square became the dominant force in everyone's lives. It was no longer a curiosity, it was a looming mystery, one that gnawed at the edges of their thoughts even as they tried to go about their daily routines. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, always with one eye on the square, always wondering if today would be the day the horse would reveal its purpose or if something else would happen. The old man who had first recalled the story about the well didn't sleep much anymore. Every night, he sat by his window, staring out at the square, as though waiting for something. His thoughts seemed consumed with the images his grandmother had passed down to him, but he couldn't make sense of them. He remembered the words she had whispered before she died, "There's more to the well than we understand, and it will wake when the time is right." But what did that mean? And how could something as simple as a horse be connected to it? The village wasn't large, but it was tight-knit. People had known each other for generations, and the idea that something unknown, something sinister, was unfolding right under their noses shook them deeply. The baker, a strong woman who had spent her entire life working with her hands, found herself growing weaker with each passing day. Her nerves, once steady and confident, were unraveling. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the horse, its black eyes staring back at her. She tried to brush it off, telling herself it was just a horse, nothing more. But there was a chill in the air that hadn't been there before, a feeling that something was being ignored. A nagging sensation, impossible to ignore, told her that she was part of something much bigger than she understood. She wasn't the only one who felt it. The younger generation, who had always been more skeptical, started to ask questions that made some of the older villagers uncomfortable. The teenagers, especially, were drawn to the horse. They couldn't resist the pull of its mystery. After school, they'd sneak down to the square, gathering in groups to watch from a distance. They weren't sure what they were hoping to see. Maybe the horse would finally speak, or maybe it would move, revealing some hidden truth. But it never did. It simply stood there, still and silent. One evening, as the sun set and the square grew dim, a group of them gathered near the edge, their voices barely above whispers. One of the boys, the most daring of the group, stood a little too close to the horse. His friends held their breath, waiting for him to back away, but he didn't. He leaned in closer, almost as though he were trying to communicate with it, to understand what it wanted. The horse seemed to sense his presence, its ears flicking toward him as if listening. The boy took a cautious step forward, reaching out his hand as if to touch its mane. "Don't," one of the girls called out, but it was too late. The boy's fingers brushed against the horse's coat, and in that instant, something shifted. The horse's head whipped around sharply, its black eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his heart stop. He froze, caught in that gaze. The world around him seemed to blur and spin, as though time itself had stopped. His friends watched, wide-eyed, as he stood motionless, barely breathing. Then, just as quickly, the boy snapped out of it, stumbling backward, his face pale, his body trembling. "What? What was that?" he gasped, his voice a mix of fear and confusion. He couldn't answer, couldn't explain what he had felt in that moment. All he knew was that it wasn't normal. It wasn't just a horse. The others hurried to him, their faces filled with concern. "Are you okay?" one of the girls asked, but he didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the horse, and his expression was blank, like he had seen something terrible. He shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "It knew me." They didn't understand what he meant, but they didn't need to. Something had shifted in that moment, something deep and unknowable. It was as if the horse had taken something from him, something that wasn't visible but left a mark nonetheless. The group didn't stay long after that. They retreated, each of them shaken, each of them wondering if what they had witnessed was real. As they made their way home, the air felt thick, as though the very ground beneath their feet was heavier than it should be. The village felt different, quieter, as though it, too, was holding its breath. Back at the old well, the horse remained motionless. But now, when people looked at it, they didn't just see a strange animal, they saw a symbol, a sign of something that had been awakened. The well no longer seemed like just an abandoned relic of the past. It was a warning, a threshold to something darker. Days turned into weeks, and still the horse stood by the well. No one knew what it wanted, but they all felt its presence like a weight pressing down on them. It wasn't just the horse anymore, it was everything around it. The air felt different. The village itself felt different, as though something was shifting in the very fabric of reality. And the more they tried to ignore it, the more they felt themselves drawn toward it. A sense of unease spread through the village like a slow burning fire. People stopped speaking to each other in the same way. They avoided the square, and when they had to pass it, they quickened their pace, their eyes darting nervously toward the horse. Some of the more superstitious villagers began to leave offerings, apples, bread, small trinkets, hoping to appease whatever force had brought the horse here. But it didn't seem to matter. The horse remained indifferent to the offerings, unbothered by the gifts left at its feet. The mayor, a man who had always prided himself on his level-headedness, found himself unable to sleep. His office, usually filled with reports and the buzz of normal life, had become a place of tension. He spent his nights staring at old maps of the village, tracing the lines of roads and fields, looking for patterns, looking for something that could explain the presence of the horse. But he found nothing. And the more he searched, the more he felt himself slipping into a state of unease. It was as though he was losing his grip on something important, something vital. One night, in a moment of desperation, he gathered a small group of villagers, those who still had the courage to confront the unknown, and decided to take action. They would go to the well, to the heart of it all, and face whatever lay there. It was a decision that would haunt them all. As they stood at the edge of the square, the tension in the air was palpable. The horse was waiting, its eyes scanning them one by one. The villagers had no idea what they were about to uncover, but they were determined to face it. The horse, however, had other plans. As they moved closer, it took a single step back, its eyes narrowing as if preparing for something. No one dared to move. No one dared to speak. And then, just as the silence reached its peak, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The well, once still and quiet, began to pulse. A low, guttural sound emanated from deep within the earth, growing louder with each passing second. The villagers stood frozen, their hearts pounding in their chests. The horse remained still, its gaze locked onto the well, waiting. Waiting for whatever was about to emerge. The ground shook again, this time with greater force. The villagers stumbled back, their hearts racing as the air seemed to thicken around them. A low, rumbling sound emanated from deep within the earth, reverberating through the square like the growl of some ancient beast waking from a long slumber. The well, once silent and forgotten, had become a living thing, pulsing, groaning, as though it were breathing. The horse, unmoving, remained fixated on the well, its black eyes gleaming in the dim light. It was as if it knew what was about to happen, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. The villagers stood frozen, too terrified to move, their breaths shallow and quick, their eyes darting between the horse and the well. The fear that had been growing in them for days, weeks even, now surged like a tidal wave, crashing over them with the weight of something far beyond their understanding. "Do you hear that?" A woman whispered, her voice barely audible, but sharp with panic. The others strained their ears, listening, as the rumbling intensified. It was no longer just a sound. It was a force, an energy that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, vibrating in their bones. Some of them instinctively stepped back, hands pressed to their chests, trying to steady their racing hearts. The mayor, despite his resolve, felt a deep sense of dread clawing at him. He had always been the one to guide others, to provide answers when the village was in need. But now, as the tremors beneath their feet grew more violent, he was no different from the rest of them, lost, vulnerable, and powerless. I think it's happening," he muttered, his voice breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. "The well. It's waking." And then, in an instant, the ground beneath them cracked open. A sharp, unnatural noise split the air, like the sound of stone tearing apart, as a deep fissure appeared in the earth, spreading outward from the base of the well. The villagers gasped, backing away as the fissure widened, sending tremors through the square. From within the depths, something was stirring, something ancient, something far more powerful than they could comprehend. The horse, still calm and unblinking, seemed to brace itself. It stood at the edge of the well, its gaze locked onto the growing darkness. It was waiting. The villagers, however, were not. Panic spread like wildfire. People turned to run, to flee the square, but their legs felt heavy, as though the ground itself was pulling them back, urging them to stay. "What is it?" someone screamed, the fear now palpable in every voice. "What's coming?" But no one had an answer. They could only watch as the fissure grew wider. The rumbling now deafening, shaking the very foundations of the village. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the earth fell silent. For a moment, no one dared to move. The square was still, the only sound the frantic beating of their hearts. The horse, as though sensing the shift in the air, stepped closer to the well. The villagers, their fear now mingling with something else, something darker, watched in silence, unable to tear their eyes away from what was unfolding before them. The well's mouth yawned wider, and with it, an ancient force began to rise. At first, it was nothing but a shadow, a shape that seemed to blur the lines between the earth and sky. Then, as the darkness began to take form, they could make out something far more sinister. A figure, tall and imposing, seemed to emerge from the well, rising slowly, deliberately, as though it were testing its strength. A gasp rippled through the crowd. The figure had no face, no features, just a black silhouette, taller than any man, cloaked in a swirling mist that seemed to writhe with an unnatural energy. The very air around it seemed to distort, bending and twisting in unnatural ways. And still, the horse stood unwavering, its eyes fixed on the shadow, as though it were in communication with it. The villagers were paralyzed with fear. Some cried out in desperation, others simply stared, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. The air grew colder, the tension in the square now thick and suffocating. It was as though time had slowed, stretching out each moment into eternity. The figure in the well continued to rise, its movements smooth, fluid, like liquid darkness taking shape. The villagers could feel it, a presence that was ancient and powerful, far beyond their reckoning. It was the kind of power that could destroy everything they knew, everything they had built. "What is it?" the mayor asked, his voice hoarse. But the question was rhetorical. They all knew deep down. They all knew that whatever this thing was, it had been waiting for centuries. It had been buried, sealed away, and now it was free. The horse stepped forward, its hooves echoing in the silence. It was no longer the creature they had seen before, docile and patient. Now it seemed like something else entirely, like a guardian, an unwilling servant to a force far more terrifying than it could ever be. It bowed its head, its eyes meeting the shadows, and the villagers could feel the weight of their connection, a bond forged in a time long past. Then, with a sudden jolt, the air shifted again. The shadow in the well reached out, its mist-like form swirling around the horse, and the two seemed to merge, their silhouettes blending together. A pulse of dark energy rippled through the square, and the ground trembled once more. The villagers were thrown backward, their bodies crashing to the ground as the shockwaves surged outward. Screams filled the air, but they were drowned out by the sound of the earth itself cracking, splitting open like the sky was coming undone. Through the chaos, one of the villagers faint from the shock looked up. What he saw sent his blood running cold. The horse was no longer alone. It was fused with the shadow, its body now twisted, distorted, as though it had become part of the very darkness that had emerged from the well. And in that moment, the full weight of the village's fate was realized. There was no going back. As the fused form of the horse and shadow towered over the village square, the ground beneath them cracked open further, sending deep, jagged fissures into the earth. The air was thick with a stench, something foul, like decay, but it was the overwhelming sensation of dread that paralyzed the villagers, leaving them unable to move. For a moment, all anyone could do was stare at the creature before them, unable to process what they were witnessing. The once familiar village square, the heart of their community, now felt like a foreign, hostile landscape. But then, just when it seemed as though the darkness would consume everything in its path, something unexpected happened. A ripple of light, faint but undeniable, began to pulse from the center of the square. It was so subtle at first that no one noticed it. The villagers remained frozen, their eyes wide with terror as the creature, the twisted amalgamation of horse and shadow, loomed over them, as if awaiting some final command. But that light, soft and fragile, continued to grow, its intensity increasing with each passing second. The mayor, barely able to breathe, found his voice. "What is that?" he gasped, his words barely audible over the growl of the dark figure. His hand, shaking uncontrollably, reached toward the light, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. But before he could speak again, the light pulsed more strongly, as if reacting to his presence. It wasn't a natural light. It didn't come from the sun or the moon, it emanated from the earth itself. It felt like something ancient, something forgotten, was waking. The villagers had never seen anything like it before, and they couldn't begin to understand what it meant. But they felt it, deep in their bones, a call to something they didn't understand. And then, without warning, the ground split open completely. A massive chasm appeared in the center of the square, stretching far wider than any of them could have imagined. The villagers screamed in panic, scrambling backward, but the light from the chasm only grew brighter. It pushed out from the depths, a warm, golden glow, illuminating everything it touched. As the darkness of the creature writhed and twisted, the light seemed to push back against it, like an opposing force, struggling to break free. The mayor's eyes widened. He realized with a sudden, sickening clarity what was happening, what had always been happening. The well, the horse, the creature, it was all part of a balance. A balance that had been disrupted long ago. And now, the ancient power of the earth was fighting to restore that balance. The question was, who would survive the battle? Before anyone could act, the light erupted. It wasn't an explosion, exactly. It was more like a surge, a wave that washed over the village in an instant. The villagers, those who had been closest to the fissure, were thrown to the ground by the force of it. The creature, its dark form recoiling, seemed to writhe in pain as the light consumed it. For a moment, there was nothing but the harsh sound of the earth groaning and cracking, the air charged with the crackling energy of something much bigger than the village had ever known. The horse, or what had once been a horse, let out a high-pitched, unnatural cry, its form twisting violently, struggling against the light that seemed to engulf it. And just as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The villagers slowly got to their feet, blinking in the now blinding light, disoriented and shaken. The creature was gone. The well was silent once more. But the square was no longer the same. The ground was scorched, cracked, and the air was heavy with the residue of something that had been unleashed. The golden light from the chasm was fading, leaving behind only an eerie glow in the distance, a beacon that seemed to pulse and beckon. The mayor looked around, his heart still pounding, his mind racing to process what had just happened. But he wasn't the only one who was changed. The villagers who had witnessed it, those who had been close enough to feel the power, were different. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with the realization that they had just been part of something impossible. Something that defied all logic and understanding. But the biggest shock was yet to come. As the mayor stumbled forward, his mind clouded with confusion, he suddenly saw something in the distance. Something he hadn't noticed before. Out of the shadows, at the far end of the square, a figure appeared. It was a person. No, not a person. Not anymore. The figure was tall and cloaked in a shimmering, transparent fabric, their face hidden in the folds of the hood. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if they were stepping into a world they no longer recognized. There was something about them, an aura of power and age, that made the hairs on the back of the mayor's neck stand on end. The villagers, already reeling from what had just transpired, gasped as the figure approached. It wasn't the darkness they feared, it wasn't the shadow or the light. It was something entirely different. A being that seemed to belong neither to this world nor the next. The figure stopped just before the mayor, their presence overwhelming. They didn't speak at first. They simply stood there, watching him with eyes that seemed to see straight through him, as if they could look into his very soul. And then, when the silence became unbearable, the figure raised one hand, and with a voice that echoed through the air, they spoke. "You think this is over," they said, their voice soft but filled with an undeniable power. "But it has only just begun." The words sent a chill through the mayor, and he realized, with a sickening feeling, that nothing would ever be the same. The village had been touched by forces far beyond their comprehension, and now there was no escaping it. The ancient balance that had been broken was stirring once more, and it was more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. As the figure turned and began to walk away, the villagers exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do next. They were no longer in control of their fate. The horse, the well, the darkness, it was all part of something bigger, something that none of them could ever hope to understand. But one thing was certain. The true battle was only just beginning. The figure's words echoed in the air long after they had spoken, sending a ripple of uncertainty through the village. The villagers, still reeling from the battle between light and shadow, stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The mayor could barely breathe. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The darkness, the well, the creature, none of it made sense, and yet he knew deep down that they hadn't seen the full picture. The figure, draped in its shrouded cloak, moved toward the center of the square, its movements deliberate and unsettling. With each step, the ground seemed to shift beneath them, as if the very earth was responding to their presence. The air grew colder, the tension palpable. "What do you want?" the mayor finally asked, his voice steady but laced with fear. The figure didn't answer immediately. It simply raised one hand, as if to signal silence. And then, with a sudden, unexpected motion, it pulled back its hood. The mayor staggered back, his heart stopping in his chest as the truth slammed into him like a bolt of lightning. It was a face he recognized. But it wasn't the person he had known. It was someone else, someone changed by time, by something ancient. The face before him was that of the village's first mayor, the man who had disappeared long ago, rumored to have been lost to the well's dark forces. But this wasn't the same man. The eyes, once kind and familiar, were now cold, distant, almost inhuman. A deep, empty void where once there had been life. "This is impossible," the mayor whispered, his voice cracking as the realization dawned. You were lost to the well." The figure, the man who should have been dead, gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. I was, he said, his voice echoing in a way that made it sound like many voices were speaking through him at once. But I wasn't lost. I was waiting. Waiting for what? The mayor demanded, his fear mingling with confusion. Waiting for the balance to be restored, the figure said, his voice growing darker, more ominous. The well is not just a place. It is a doorway, a gateway between worlds. I was chosen, just like the others, to guard it. But that duty has become twisted over time. The earth, the shadow, the light, they are all bound together in a delicate harmony. And when the harmony is broken, as it was, everything falls into chaos. The mayor's heart raced as the figure continued to speak, his mind struggling to process the flood of information. You said it had just begun, the mayor said, voice trembling. What do you mean by that? The figure's eyes darkened, the void in them deepening. The balance is still not restored, he explained, his voice growing more intense. You have seen the surface, the fight between the light and the shadow. But it is not just about light and dark. There are forces far more ancient, more powerful than any of us can comprehend, and they are watching. They have been watching for centuries. Suddenly, the ground began to tremble again, but this time, it was different. The air shifted, crackling with an energy that felt suffocating, overwhelming. The light from the chasm, once fading, began to surge once more, a golden torrent that spread out like wildfire, engulfing the village in its glow. The mayor turned, instinctively shielding his eyes from the brilliance, but the figure no longer even resembling the man he had once been stood still, watching it all unfold with an eerie calm. No, the figure whispered, almost to himself, this was never meant to happen. With a forceful gesture, he raised both hands toward the sky, and the light faltered. The golden glow began to twist and distort, pulling itself back into the chasm. The energy shifted violently, the earth shaking beneath their feet, the ground cracking open like the very bones of the world were breaking. The villagers screamed, running in panic, but the figure was unbothered, focused solely on the chasm, as if controlling the force with his mind. The mayor's heart raced in his chest as he tried to make sense of what was happening. It was all too much. The well, the horse, the shadow, the figure, it was all connected, but how? What was this force that seemed to be tearing the village apart, and why had it taken so long to surface? And then, with a deafening roar, the final twist came. The well exploded. Not with a burst of water or debris, but with something far worse. It was as if the very fabric of reality itself had torn open. From the depths, a darkness poured out, vast, ancient, and powerful. It was no longer just a figure. It was a force, a void that consumed everything in its path. The mayor, caught in the shockwave, felt himself being pulled toward it, drawn into the darkness. His body seemed to freeze in place as the world around him dissolved into shadow. The villagers, too, were pulled into the force, their screams echoing through the void. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the darkness vanished. The village was silent. The light from the chasm faded, leaving only an eerie, haunting stillness. The square was empty. No villagers, no creature, nothing but the echoes of what had happened. The mayor, dazed, stumbled to his feet, looking around in confusion. Had it all been a dream? Was this the end? But then, in the distance, the faintest glimmer of movement caught his eye. He turned, heart pounding, and saw a figure standing at the edge of the square. It was the horse. Or what was left of it. Its form, twisted and broken, had returned. The horse's eyes, now empty and hollow, locked onto the mayor's, and for the first time, the mayor understood. The true nature of the well, the creature, the figure, it was all part of a cycle. A never-ending cycle that would never truly end. Not for him. Not for the village. And as the horse began to move toward him, the mayor realized with a shiver that the battle was far from over. The darkness, the forces beyond the well, had only just begun to make their presence felt. And now, the cycle would continue once more. The village would never be the same. Neither would he. The air hung thick with tension, the eerie silence settling like a weight across the village. The horse, broken, disfigured, and yet somehow alive, moved toward the mayor, its every step deliberate, unnerving. The villagers who had once filled the square were gone, vanished into the dark void that had consumed the village moments earlier. But the mayor couldn't tear his eyes away from the creature. There was something in the air, something he couldn't explain, that held him in place. His mind raced as he remembered the warnings, the stories passed down through generations, the whispers of the well and the powers that lay beneath. He had never truly believed them. The well was just a curiosity, a strange anomaly in their small, quiet village. But now, standing face to face with the creature that had come from its depths, he realized how wrong he had been. The balance between light and shadow had been fragile, and it had been shattered. And now, the consequences were unfolding before him. The horse, if it could still be called that, stopped just a few feet away from him. Its eyes, empty, hollow, stared into his, and for a moment, the mayor felt a coldness seep into his very soul. It was as if the creature was looking past him, into some deeper part of him, seeing the truth he had been blind to all along. He had been part of the cycle. He was part of what had gone wrong. He took a hesitant step forward, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The horse didn't move, didn't respond. But in that stillness, the air seemed to crackle with a presence that was more than just the creature. It was as though the very earth itself was watching, waiting for something to happen. The mayor had no answers, no clue what was coming, but he knew deep in his bones that this was not the end. This was a new beginning. The ground trembled again, but this time, it wasn't the destruction of the well, or the arrival of the darkness. It was something else, something more grounded, more real. The earth seemed to hum beneath his feet, a deep, resonant vibration that felt almost like a heartbeat. And then, before he could even react, the horse lowered its head. In that moment, something shifted. The creature, this broken thing that had come from the well, from the darkness, seemed to release a breath, a deep, shuddering exhale that reverberated through the square. The tension, the fear, that had gripped the mayor's chest for so long suddenly loosened. It was a strange feeling, one of release, of recognition, as if the village had been waiting for this moment for centuries. And then, the unthinkable happened. The horse, with a slow, deliberate motion, began to change. Its form twisted, reshaped. The broken, disjointed creature that had once been a shadow of its former self began to solidify, the darkness retreating from its body, leaving only the purest form of the creature, a horse. It was no longer monstrous. It was beautiful, majestic, like the kind of creature one might see in a dream. The shadows that had clung to it, the darkness that had twisted its being, were gone. In their place was something pure, something sacred. The mayor could hardly believe what he was witnessing. He stood frozen, his mouth dry, unable to comprehend how such a transformation could be possible. But in the depths of his heart, he felt that this was the answer. The village had been saved, not by force, but by understanding. The balance had been restored. The cycle had completed, but in a way no one had ever imagined. The horse took a few tentative steps toward the mayor, its movements graceful, almost like a dance. It stopped just before him, and for the first time since the well had erupted, the mayor felt a sense of peace. The danger was over. The darkness had retreated. The village had been given a second chance. But the mayor knew that the village's fate, and his own, had been irrevocably changed. He couldn't go back to the way things were. No one could. The well, the shadows, the strange forces, they were always there, beneath the surface, waiting. The village's story had been one of balance, but that balance was fragile. And now, more than ever, the villagers needed to remember that. The horse, now calm and at peace, turned its head and glanced back toward the well, its gaze lingering for a moment before it slowly began to walk toward the edge of the square. The mayor took one last look at the creature, feeling a strange connection to it, as if they both understood the weight of what had transpired. With a final, lingering glance, the horse disappeared into the distance, fading into the mist that had begun to settle over the village. The mayor stood in silence, watching it go, unsure of what to do next. There were no answers, no easy solutions. Only a deep, unsettling sense of what had been lost and what had been found. As the sun began to rise over the village, casting a soft, golden light over the ruined square, the mayor took a deep breath. The darkness was gone for now. The cycle had ended, but the memories would remain. The villagers began to trickle back into the square, hesitant at first, unsure of what to expect. They were quiet, their faces etched with fear and confusion, but as they saw the mayor standing there, they began to understand. The village had been spared. The horse, the shadow, the well, they were all part of something bigger, something beyond their comprehension. And now, they had to live with the knowledge that they had been touched by forces beyond their control. The mayor knew he couldn't explain it all, not to the villagers, not to anyone. There were no words for what had happened. But as he looked around at the faces of his people, he realized that maybe that was okay. Sometimes, not knowing was enough. Sometimes, the mystery was all that mattered. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its warm light over the village, the mayor couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. The balance had been restored. The darkness had been pushed back. And maybe, just maybe, the village would thrive once more. But as he looked toward the distant horizon, where the horse had disappeared into the mist, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. There was still more to this story, more to the well, to the shadow, to the forces at play in this strange, ancient world. And though the village had been saved for now, he knew the darkness was never far away. The cycle had ended. But it could always begin again.